Fáilte Galar, you are all very, very welcome to the conversation today, and I am honoured to be joined by Danny Morrison. Danny, as you know, has been a Republican activist all his life. He's a broadcaster, an author, a playwright. He's had a very interesting life and has been credited with some great speaks over the years. Danny has also stood a number of times in elections. He was elected in the Mid-Ulster seat, I think in 1982 in that assembly, and has contested the European seat as well. He's been a great friend of Republicans in Fermanagh South Tyrone, and I'm proud to know him as a friend, him and his lovely wife Leslie. So I suppose for a lot of us, there's people listening to this today for whom 40 years is 2 lifetimes. It seems like a long, long time in history. But for many of us, the hunger strike only seems like a blink. And the time period that we're talking about sometimes feels like it could be yesterday. So I want to first of all ask you, Danny, tell us about your recollections of the time. We're obviously talking in the anniversary of the by-election that saw Bobby Sands elected as MP for Fermanagh South Tyrone. And there'd been a very turbulent time since the 1st of March when Bobby started his hunger strike to the 5th of March when our MP Frank Maguire died of a massive heart attack, and then the subsequent days following that. So will you talk to us about your recollections of the 9th of April 1981 and the lead up to that, please?
Well, Frank Maguire had been a very good friend of the prisoners and of the prisoners' cause. He himself had been interned in the 1950s, and I think he was an agreed independent, perhaps in the 74 general election, in October 74. I think that's when he was first elected. His sudden death, took everyone by surprise, and when an MP dies, it doesn't necessarily mean that a by-election is automatically triggered. A petition or a motion has to be passed in the House of Commons or a writ has to be moved in the House of Commons. And that wasn't in our power, of course, to do that. And the first person that I recall mentioning the possibility of putting forward Bobby Sands or a candidate who was working for the prisoners was Jim Gildernew when he came into the office where I was working as I was the editor of Infoblock, Republican News, and also the National Director of Publicity for Sinn Féin. And it was Jim who first proposed, he says, it'd be a great opportunity if there was a by-election to put forward Bobby Sands. And if you look at the later edition or the new updated edition of Bobby Sands' diary, you can see there's a column there published by Bick McFarlane where Bick is thinking along the same lines. So the actual proposal to have an electoral intervention, I suppose, has many fathers and mothers. I know that people claim that it was Daithí O'Connell's idea, others that it was, a variety of individuals' ideas, but it was an opportunity, but it didn't appear solid until it was mooted that it was going to be a writ moved for a by-election. I think Ard Collier of Sinn Féin had met and discussed it, but came to no hard decision until there was a meeting called of Republicans. I think it was in the Swan Hotel in Monaghan, and Jerry Adams had Swan Lake Hotel. And I was on a phone in Belfast, and Jerry Adams was at that meeting to keep me up to date about what the decision was. And I think the decision actually was against it. There was a lot of people who were opposed to it for a variety of reasons, many of them good, sincere reasons, the risk of losing the election and the demoralising effect that would have on the campaign for the restoration of political status, but for also saving the life of Bobby Sands. And of course, two weeks later, or a week later, Bobby had been joined by Francis Hughes, and then 2 weeks later by Patsy O'Hara and Raymond McCreish. So it was a very critical time, and it was also an enterprise that had many, many risks. However, the decision was taken to run a candidate, but there were certain provisos attached to it. So, for example, we didn't want a divisive campaign where Bobby was slogging it out with a member of the SDLP or a proxy SDLP candidate. So what we wanted lined up were ideal conditions, that it would be on the nationalist stroke Republican side, an individual standing. In this case, it would be Bobby. And on the other side, whoever the unionists were putting up, as it eventually turned out, it was Harry West, who was the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party. Now, I know that Gerry Adams and perhaps Jim Gildernew travelled down to speak to Noel Maguire. And Noel Maguire, to many in the constituency, was a natural heir to Frank. I think he was not only Frank's election agent, but he probably did a fair amount of the constituency work on Frank's behalf. So the writ was moved, and Noel agreed that he would step aside, provided, of course, that Bobby could be the only candidate. There was a hair-raising moment on the day of nominations because Austin Curry of the SDLP had threatened to intervene and stand against Bobby. And of course, we know that Austin Curry subsequently went to the south and became a field candidate for Fine Gael in the Dublin constituency. But when he learnt that Noel Maguire was standing, he didn't put forward his papers. So what happened on the actual day in the electoral office in Dungannon was that Noel Maguire pulled out his nomination papers very late in the day, and I think it was Francie Malloy and Owen Carron went in with Bobby's nomination papers. Also in the diary is Bobby's agreement to be a candidate, his nomination papers, which were signed in the presence of his solicitor, Pat Finucane, who of course we know was later assassinated by state agents in 1989. So I was actually that day, I was actually in Dublin making a film called Ireland's Hunger Strikes as part of the publicity campaign to rally support for the hunger strikers. And there was a news flash. I remember on the Dublin radio station, there was a news flash saying that Bobby Sands was going to be fighting with Harry West. And so we were over all the initial dangers and difficulties of there being a split nationalist vote, although there were some, I think some people did stand for that monster raving lunatic party. I think that guy stood. So that was the setup. Now we were brought back to a meeting in Belfast, and it was our intentions to go up there to organise. Now listen to this. It was our intention to go up there and organise and show the people what should be done, us city slickers. And it was an eye-opener. It was a great experience to meet all of these veterans who had been for years maintaining registers, almost for this moment in a sense. And they had, because they had already elected, Fermanagh South Tyrone had previously in the 1950s, as had Mid-Ulster, elected political prisoner candidates. And I should add, just across the border, John Joe McGurl had been elected for Leitrim in the 1950s, and Rory O'Brady himself in the Roscommon constituency. So it wasn't the first time. If you go back to the 1918 campaign for the general election, when many Sinn Féin candidates were interned in Frongach prison or were on the run, and the campaign then had been put him in to get him out. So there had been a whole history of electoral interventions involving prisoners. But I think this was the first time that a prisoner who was on hunger strike had been put up for election. So the stakes were extremely high. Coming down into Dungannon and then into Enniskillen and meeting with the people, it was just for me, I had participated in elections, I must confess, as a 17-year-old, when Jerry Fitt was a great hero in West Belfast. This was just 2 months before the SDLP were formed. I remember a future SDLP manager of the West Belfast constituency, approaching myself and other young people and giving us ballot papers to personate for Jerry Fitt. Because this was the days when, you know, afterwards the SDLP denied all knowledge of us, but this was a constant feature. And it was also actually, in a way, quite counterproductive, because the other side was doing it as well, and you were wasting a lot of energy in trying to get people out in 1970 just to counteract the people on the other side. It would have been far better if all energy had been put into maximising the vote. So we learned a lot of things when we met the people up in Fermanagh and South Tyrone. They had everything at their fingertips, registers. They knew all about postal votes, absent votes. It was just extraordinary. It was very humbling, I have to say, very, very humbling. And so we threw in our lot. It was a big campaign. It involved people who were not Republicans, people who were old nationalists. It included independents, and of course, lots of people from across Ireland came in to add their weight to it. It was an extraordinary, incredible campaign. Now, the harassment was unbelievable. I mean, I think Jim Gibney and I were out in a car and we were probably stopped, 10 times. And the whole point of it was to stop us from canvassing, to reduce the campaign. And of course, Harry West supporters, they weren't getting stopped anywhere. I mean, I remember them stopping and actually checking the mirrors to see if the mirrors worked. This is UDR patrol. It might have been a wee place, you would know this. Is there a place called Red Hills? Red Hills?
Yeah.
A little hamlet somewhere. I remember getting tortured there. And there were other incidents. Our posters were getting torn down. I think there was certainly a gun attack on the Dungannon office. I think a passing car fired at people putting up posters along the main road. There was also a very funny incident. Belfast people had been brought down to do a leaflet canvass and to do after mass meetings, and they came back to the Enniskillen office and said they were very, very despondent. And they said that they didn't think Bobby was going to get elected. People had refused the leaflets, the election year literature. And I'm not sure who it was. It might have been Pat McCaffrey or somebody turned around and said, asked them where they had been. There had been canvassing outside the Church of Ireland on the main road. No wonder people weren't taking leaflets. But I mean, the energy behind it was incredible. And then, of course, on election day in the Technical College in Enniskillen, it was packed with world media. It was an extraordinary event because Thatcher had thrown down the gauntlet. Thatcher said, "How can I talk to you if you don't have a mandate?" So here was an opportunity for us and for Bobby and the prisoners cause, the men in the H blocks, the women in Armagh, to have a nominated elected representative, an MP, and there would be the mandate. So there was a lot riding on the outcome of it. Now, of course, there were also big dangers, because if Bobby had been defeated by one vote, Thatcher would have said, even your own people reject you. Why should I compromise? Why should I engage, in discussions to resolve the issue? So, and of course, and because myself and Adams, Bobby had nominated me as his external spokesperson, so I was doing all the radio and television political broadcasts. And because the people who were in the leadership, who subsequently themselves were elected in 82 and Adams as MP for West Belfast in 83, we would have been totally discredited as well. And it's, looking back now, it's difficult to see how Sinn Féin could have made its transformation into the most popular party representing the nationalist community in the North from 2001, whenever you were elected in Fermanagh and South Tyrone. We would have been totally discredited, and perhaps the whole cause of electoralism would have been discredited. But I just felt it in my bones canvassing that there was a sea change taking place. And I had also noticed that in the first hunger strike campaign from October to the 18th of December 1980, a lot of people looking back to Bloody Sunday, when the people were cut down, there was a huge march the following week in Newry, which many, many thousands of people showed up at. But that was an act of defiance. There was lots of people, thousands of people, my relatives, stopped marching after Bloody Sunday because they were terrified. They were afraid, or also of being identified and discriminated against if they were in a mixed workplace. So for 9 years, the mobilisations had been very, very limited. Gallant work done by the Relatives Action Committees, which gave rise to the National H Block Armagh Committee. And of course, many of its leaders were assassinated claimed by loyalists, but obviously British intelligence were behind those state killings. So it was to see people coming out during the first hunger strike. I saw doctors, I saw nurses, I saw SDLP people, what people would call Sticks, Workers' Party people, all coming out and marching on the first hunger strike. So it was obvious that things were changing, that that the courage of the prisoners and the nobility of what they were going through and suffering and standing up against was having an effect, an emotional effect amongst the community. And so during the second hunger strike, people were even more angry than the first one because they knew that at the end of it, Thatcher had at her disposal a document which they had promised would involve an enlightened prison regime and would resolve the conflict. But of course, when Bobby Sands and others tried to claim their clothes at the end of the first hunger strike, the Brits said, "Oh, no, put on your clothes, put on the uniform to get the clothes." And it was obvious that nothing had changed and they had become actually quite triumphant as a result of the circumstances of the end of the first hunger strike. And this fueled the anger on the streets behind the second hunger strike, led by Bobby Sands. And of course, Bobby decided the strategy, he would go out on his own so that there would be people, when it reached a critical point, there would still be hunger strikers and the OC of the prison, Brendan McFarlane, and he had nominated myself and Jerry Adams externally as guarantors, that there'd be people there to be involved and not just a person who was like 50 days on hunger strike or 60 days on hunger strike. That was the strategy that Bobby devised, a rolling hunger strike. So on the day, the election took place on the 9th of April. It was clear from the queues at polling stations, that something had been reawakened here. And then on election day itself, as the ballot papers went up for Harry West and then for Bobby, neck and neck, and then you could see Bobby's piles increasing. I remember Eamon Malley coming over to me and saying, "What do you think?" Well, I says, "He's going to take it. Bobby Sands is going to win this seat." And we were all excited. And when it came to the returning officer declaring the result, I was so excited, I let out an almighty yell. I was just so hopeful that this would resolve the hunger strike without anyone losing their lives. Another thing that happened was that whenever Harry West got up to make to speak afterwards, because Owen Carn, a young teacher, Owen must have been 25 or 26 years of age. Owen was Bobby's election agent and had been presenting him in terms of the election, in terms of speeches to be made in the constituency, etc. But when Harry West got up to make his speech, and he was reading from a piece of paper, and he was reading a victory speech. He hadn't realised that he had lost, and he stumbled, and I felt a lot of sympathy for him, felt very sorry for him. And then he sort of stuffed it back in his pocket, and I think he may have actually condemned the people of Fermanagh and South Tyrone. But it was just a moment there, an incredible moment. We did lots of interviews. We left in a skill and technical college. I travelled with Mr. and Mrs. Sands and Marcella in the car back to Belfast, where I was going to continue to do like Newsnight, and the media attention was extraordinary. So there was this hope that the people of Fermanagh and South Tyrone, by voting for Bobby Sands against, terrible intimidation, political intimidation, moral intimidation, all sorts of things were used against them. Interventions in the House of Commons on the day of the election, which is actually against convention, and they came out and they voted to save Bobby Sands' life. And the reaction of Thatcher was to rush emergency legislation through the House of Commons, amending the Representation of the People Act to ensure that no other political prisoner, not just in the North, but she made this apply to everywhere in the world, in case we put forward, for example, a prisoner from Portlaoise, or an Irish Republican prisoner in Germany or in France or in North America. Now, the effect of that legislation actually backfired on her, because it meant that after Bobby's death, and another by-election, another that was moved at one stage incredibly by James Molyneux of the Ulster Unionist Party, thinking that it would be a different election the second time around with no political prisoner standing. And because we were barred from putting a political prisoner forward and the hunger strike was still continuing, we put forward Owen Carron, who was a member of Sinn Féin but ran on a National H Bloc Armagh political prisoner ticket. And again, that was another extraordinary campaign. And again, Owen was elected by the people of Fermanagh and South Tyrone. You know, it's very interesting. Bobby actually got a bigger majority than Thatcher got in her constituency in Finchley. And the attention of the world, you know, was just focused here on that battle, David versus Goliath, a young man, 27 years of age, had spent a third of his life in prison. There had been relative peace in the jails until the British government decided to renege on a settlement of the prison issue in May 1972, when, after another hunger strike and before anyone died, they had accepted political prisoner status, which they call special category status. So the British created this problem. They knew from history, I mean, you go right back to Wolfe Tone, Thomas Ashe, O'Donovan Rossa, you know, Republicans would never accept the criminalisation, which is a strategy used by occupying powers, imperial powers, colonial powers, wherever they go, to make second-class citizens, to humiliate the natives. And they knew, their civil servants knew, because they would have had to have their eyes right across history, that Republicans would never accept this situation in the H blocks and Armagh. And yet they set out deliberately, because their strategy was that if we can defeat and demoralise Republican prisoners in the jail, it'll defeat and demoralise the Republican resistance outside the jails. It was as callous as that. Single out these people.
Yeah, Maggie Thatcher, I grew up hearing of Maggie Thatcher, and when the first hunger strike had failed, the fact that Bobby Sands went into the second one knowing that he would die, the fact that this was a young man, 27 years of age, as you've said, spent a third of his life in prison, had educated himself in the prison, had an understanding of international struggles and conflicts around the world, had a historical understanding of, you know, what was happening in France or in the United States or in India. A fascinating man, and to have the knowledge, the breadth and depth of knowledge that he had, but the strength of his convictions as well, to go into that hunger strike. You talked about his majority. Bobby's majority was 1,447 votes. When Owen Carron stood in the subsequent by-election, he increased the majority, and we know then that the SDLP split the vote in the subsequent election, and Owen lost that seat. But I think Bobby Sands is a remarkable young man, and anybody who can should read some of his works. I mean, a poet, a storyteller, a songwriter. He really was fascinating as a person. And I suppose the history of elections in Fermanagh South Tyrone, and, you know, not just Frank Maguire, but Frank McManus before him, Cahir Healy and Philip Clark, who had stood in the 50s. We had a history of elections, but never an election like this one. And we know how you just talked about the Republican prisoners and what they went through. And I was involved in a conversation at the weekend about the women and about what they went through, because obviously the women in Armagh were on a subsequent the same hunger strike, along with the men. Didn't come off it, didn't believe that the hunger strike had ended, and wouldn't come off it until they heard factually. But when you look at what the women went through as well, the strip searching and the state-sanctioned sexual violence on the women in both Armagh and Maghaberry, I mean, really and truly, the British government thought they were taking on the weakest link, and they took on the strongest people within the Republican movement. And the hunger strike was just a pivotal moment for all of us. And I know it certainly changed my life. Talk a wee bit, Danny, about you talked about the countdown, about Harry West and all of that, and the famous yo that you let out of you. I think we all heard that. And even yet, those iconic images of the returning officer reading out the result, and Bobby's 30,493 votes. You know, that was one of those moments in time that you never ever forget. What the prisoners went through, not just throughout the hunger strike, but leading up to that, the no wash protest and all of that. The fact that political status had been taken off the prisoners, and the fact that Maggie Thatcher was absolutely determined to break the struggle. But there must have been stories too that we haven't heard before, that I want you to talk about as well. You talked about your reflections and getting stopped and all of that, but I think there was an incident, was there, when you were getting photographed by the Ulster Herald? Is that right? I think in these days we all know about having Zoom meetings and been dressed from the top up, but is there something you wanted to talk about? Just a wee lighthearted moment of reflection on that campaign and what happened there?
Well, but just before I come to that, when the hunger strike ended in October 1981, 10 prisoners had died. Many people had died on the outside, including young people killed by plastic bullets. Julie Livingstone, 14 years of age, shot dead. I mean, in the street, where I lived, a bored British soldier driving past the Jeep shot the nose of a kid on a bicycle. I mean, that's not in statistics anywhere. The soldier was never charged. Kid being disfigured. A friend of mine, Nora McCabe, mother of 3, ran out of cigarettes the morning that Joe McDonald died. And her house was 2 doors away from the shop. She went down to get a packet of cigarettes. And the assistant chief constable at the time, Jimmy Crutchley, ordered the cop in the back to open fire and killed her. No one has ever brought to justice for these things. So the hunger strike in that period of 1981, in a way, although it was stretched out over a 7-month period, and there had been years preceding that of prison protests, it was our 1916. It was my generation's 1916. It had that effect on the community, especially young people. I mean, the defiance of young people. We brought out hunger strike badges, little badges. And back then, perhaps it was the same in Dungannon and Enniskillen, but the town centres were security zones, and Belfast city centre was a gated area. And to go through it, you had to be searched by the British Army or the UDR. And these kids were wearing these badges, and the UDR, take that off. The kids were saying, you try taking it off. And there's all sorts of fights and little things that you never hear about. The women who took over the city centre shops, and put hunger strike posters in the windows. There was this extraordinary confidence built up in the nationalist community. I mean, we weren't allowed to march in the Belfast city centre until the peace process. The Orange Order, when I was a kid, the Orange Order marched on the Falls Road. So what the hunger strike did was it just emboldened the community. These people, these women and men can go through this, then what more can we do? It was just incredible. It was a revolution amongst the nationalist community. So when the hunger strike ended, Owen Cairn was the MP for Manor South Tyrone. And we had to decide what to do, because there were people who were saying it was a one-off intervention, right? Owen should resign and there should be a by-election. Our attitude was some chance. What we have, we hold. And Owen's election office in Enniskillen and his election office, I think it was in Ann Street or Irish Street in Dungannon, we turned them into constituency offices. And people came in as secretaries, as advice centre workers. And Owen was getting calls from right across the community. And because he was an abstentionist MP, he was there all the time, fighting for them. But what also happened at the end of the hunger strike was almost immediately the British government gave the prisoners their own clothes. And over the course, right up until the big escape, after the big escape, the prisoners, when I went into the H blocks, I was sentenced 8 years. And when I went in, 5 demands, 25 demands were given. You know, when I was being locked up on my first night in the H blocks, the prison officer, Screw, said to me, "Is it okay if I lock the door, Danny?" And then he said to me, "Ihawa, good night." And I was thinking, the suffering that went on in this place. And at the end of it, and it's quoted in that book, Hunger Strike Reflections, prison governor says, you know, we always knew they were political prisoners, but we were just told to do that. And it was a disgrace that what happened and what the suffering that they inflicted on our people. So when the hunger strike ended, there was a new Secretary of State, James Pryor. And one of the first things he said was that I'm thinking of setting up an assembly and there will be rule and devolution. As it improves, I will give it more powers. Now, our political position had been that we didn't contest elections as an organisation. Sinn Féin did not contest elections in the North. Yes, there had been interventions, you know, like, for example, Albert Price, whose 2 daughters were in hunger strike in 1974, stood in an election, and we had also used prisoners to intervene in elections. But because we were barred from standing in elections, that meant that the local government elections that took place in May 1981, after Bobby had died, we couldn't contest them. And so what we saw was that People's Democracy, IRSP, Irish Independence Party, people getting elected on councils all over the place, which would have been votes probably that would have come to Sinn Féin had they been on the ticket. So we decided to change our policy at the Ardèche in October, November 1981. And the Ard Comhairle put forward a motion, especially with its eye to this assembly election. And the motion was that for the Ardèche to vote to give the Ard Comhairle power to make a decision about whether or not they intervene in any election that takes place. Now, it would be an abstentionist ticket. So we just thought it was an open and shut case. We went to the Ardèche in the Mansion House in Dublin, and suddenly there was a lot of people, including Fermanagh people, standing up and said, no, this was a one-off, right? We're not going down that road. And we, on the platform, we started saying, this is going against us. And remember, I was saying, listen, we have to get up and speak to this motion. So I was in the queue and I got up, and without plan, without thought, I come off with the Armalite in the ballot box strategy, in which I was saying that it was possible for us to have an electoral strategy, and the IRA would still wage its armed struggle. And and I suppose in a sense I was playing to the gallery for that, from that point of view, but we won the vote, and it then meant that that we could decide on the merits of any future electoral intervention without having to recall the Ardèche like in a 3-week period in the run of the election, and it also meant we could prepare. So we had prepared, and Pryor did call an election for October 1982, and we needed at least 12 candidates in order to qualify for radio and TV time, because we had never contested elections before, and we had 13 candidates. But then on the morning of the close of nominations, Tom Hartley came to me to say that there had been an argument in Mid-Ulster amongst the supporters. Now, not amongst Francie Hughes, who was Martin Hurson's brother, Francie Hurson, who was one of the candidates, and Sean Begley, whose brother-in-law, Pat McCune, had been on hunger strike. It was their supporters couldn't agree on the carve-up of where the lane should be, where the first and second preferences should be. And it had got out of hand. So myself, Tom Hartley, and Francie Malloy and Owen Carn, we went up to get at least one of them to agree to stand so that we would have 12 candidates. Now, I wasn't a candidate. I was the editor in Phoblacht and the director of publicity. I wasn't on the list. And I remember being told that if we cannot get the two of them to stand, you're to stand. Right? This is without, I know this is done irregularly, right? But if we didn't have, it was the close of nominations, and we went and we met, and Francie and Sean were brilliant. And I'm not sure if it was Francie Hurson or Sean Begley. I think it was Francie Hurson proposed, without me mentioning this side brief, right? Why don't you stand? So I was chosen as a candidate. Francie became my director of elections. Sean Begley became my election agent. The factions were united. We had 12 candidates, and that's how I ended up in Mid-Ulster. So I was, and that morning I left the house as editor of An Phoblacht, and that night at 5 o'clock when I was driving down to Dublin to edit the paper, Radio Ulster was reporting a surprise 12th candidate. That was myself. So I stayed with Francie Hurson. I lived with Francie and Sally Hurson for many years because I was elected to the constituency. But one night at about, this is going back to your story, one night at, it must have been about 12:30 at night, I'm down in bed. Francie wakens me up and says, you have to get your photograph taken for the Ulster Herald. There's a deadline approaching. So I just got up and I stuck on a shirt, and Francie says, you need a tie. And I stuck on a tie, and I think I wore his jacket. So the photographer came in, I sat on a stool in Francie's kitchen. They photographed me from the waist up because I had nothing but underpants on down below. And if you look at the photograph carefully, I think it was the Ulster Herald, if you look at the photograph carefully, you will see that there's nothing below my waist. So that was another brilliant campaign, the Sinn Féin intervention in 1982. And then, of course, the following May, I was nominated to stand in Mid-Ulster, and I lost by 78 votes to William McRae. And it was a huge campaign of intimidation by loyalists. For example, in Coke, they went in, they were repeatedly, we for the first time ever, we put people in polling stations where there had never been a nationalist presence in deep unionist areas. And they were challenging personation. And in one case, in Coke, a loyalist actually came in and produced a gun and says, if you don't get out of here, right, we'll kill you and your family. Mm-hmm. At the same time, there's no mobile phones in those days. When Sean Begley and I were in Pomeroy, we got a phone call from Mountfield to say that the DUP had closed a polling station in Mountfield, alleging that there had been impersonation. So we jumped in the car and we got there at about 10 to 10, and there was about 150 people waiting to vote. And we went up to the poll or the electoral lane and said, what are you doing? Oh, the DUP alleges there's personation. We said, oh, well, challenge the people and get them arrested if you think they're personating. We said, you have no right to close down the station. So he reopened the station. About 30 people got voting, and he closed the station. And so on polling day, our votes were neck and neck. There was a four-way. Dennis Hockey had stood for the SDLP, and in the assembly elections in October 1982, the SDLP were ahead of us by 4,000 votes among all the candidates. PR election, but at this time around, we overtook them by 4,000 votes. So Sinn Féin was the majority party basically from 1983 onwards in Mid-Ulster. And of course, Martin McGuinness later on became the MP for the area. So we got elected. Adams then took West Belfast off Jerry Fitt in May '83. And it looked like it was, just a powerful, continuum of progress. But of course, there were problems. I mean, obviously, we opened up advice centres. We did the constituency work. In the South, in the June general election during the hunger strike in 1981, we put forward many prisoner candidates, including Martin Herson, Joe McDonald, Kieran Doherty. Mairead Farrell stood as well. Mairead, who had been on hunger strike in 1980, and of course was killed by the SAS in Gibraltar in 1988. And we got two people elected, Kieran Doherty for Cavan Monaghan and Paddy Agnew for County Louth. And that intervention, by the way, deprived hockey of a majority. And from that point onwards, there have been coalition governments in the south of Ireland as a result of that intervention. Now, when it came to the following general election in the south, when Gareth Fitzgerald called an election in February '82, our vote, the prisoner vote, disappeared, and it went back to the basic Sinn Féin vote at council level in those constituencies. And it was quite obvious to us that there was a problem with the fact that in the north, the nationalist community were alienated from the state. That was taken from the point of partition onwards. We were second class. We were treated as second class. We were looked down upon. But in the 26 counties over the years, although partition and the Free State had been contested and the Civil War had been fought, and over the years, after Fianna Fáil split from Sinn Féin and entered Leinster House, the people in the south didn't view the institutions of the state the same way as the nationalist community did in the north. And we had a problem there with identifying with people. And that ultimately was to lead to the decision of the Ardèche in 1986 to end abstentionism towards Leinster House. And also, of course, that was when Rory and Daithí left to form Republican Sinn Féin.
Absolutely. Well, God, Danny, I'm exhausted just listening to all of that. And we could talk about this all day. And obviously, this is fascinating for those people who didn't live through it and who can maybe understand now some of those battlegrounds around election times. It's interesting. I was thinking about the election in 2001 when people were queuing up to get voting in Garrison, and some people didn't get voting in that election either. And the rules changed then, that anyone who was in the curtilage of the polling station can now vote. So if you're in the grounds of the primary school or wherever the polling station is, you can still vote, even if it happens slightly after 10 o'clock. So, things, it's taken an awful long time and an awful lot of battles to try and get a bit of equality and a bit of fairness in the electoral process. Danny, before you go, and I think I just want to point out to anybody, the people listening here today, this is your book, Hunger Strike, and it is reflections by Christy Moore, Ken Loach, Francis Black, Robert Bennett, Ronan Bennett, many people. This is worth a read. So if anybody wants to try and get their hands on that, I would definitely recommend it. I also would just ask you, Danny, the last thing before we go, in terms of Bobby Sands' writings and the Bobby Sands Trust and the work of that, for young people who want to learn more about this remarkable man, what would your go-to, the diary is an obvious one, but what other resources are there that people can try and understand what drove this incredible man to do what he did, and the leadership and the courage that he showed?
Well, I mean, there's a great book written by a South African journalist, the late David Beresford, called 10 Men Dead. And when he came to us with this idea in 1984, 1985, he wasn't aware of the fact that Tom Hartley, in his foresight, had kept all of the original communications that were sent out of the jail to the Republican leadership. Back then, people need to understand, our office on the Falls Road, was car bombed, shot at. We barricaded the doors to slow down British Army raids. They often stole photographs. They stole material, invaluable historical documents were seized and stolen and never returned. So Tom had organised a vast communication system with Armagh and the H blocks. That he had about 10 or 12 women full time who were up and down the jail. He had always somebody in the jail on a morning visit or an afternoon visit, smuggling comms. And as soon as these comms were transcribed, he had them smuggled out of the office and put in a safe house. And so there's thousands of these documents lodged in the National Library in Dublin, in the Bobby Sands Trust archive. And when David Beresford was writing his book and he heard about them, and this was before we put them in the National Library, he asked us, could he access them? So he's been probably, apart from ourselves, who were intimately involved with the communication process, we give him access to them. And so many of them appear in 10 Men Dead. And it's an extraordinary book, which is, in 36 years, has never been out of print, nor has Bobby's prison diary been out of print. But there's Bobby's poetry remains in publication. And this year we have also been involved in, we're bringing out a book called The Comrades, which are going to be biographical pieces on the 12 hunger strikers, because of course 2 of our prisoners died in England, Michael Gaughan in June 74 and Frank Stagg in February 76, looking for a simple transference to a prison closer to home, which is part of the European Convention on Human Rights. I mean, any Brit that even was ever charged here with hitting somebody in a bar or whatever offence were immediately transferred to a prison closer to their homes. That small number of them who actually ever faced a courtroom. But they refused that. So those two men died. So we've got a book coming out in the next 3 months, written by prisoners about those prisoners. And that's called The Comrades. I myself have just finished editing a book with Palestinians, and it's about the experiences of surviving Palestinian hunger strikers and Republican hunger strikers. So it would feature people like Tommy McKerney and Pat Sheehan and Mary Doyle, who was on the first hunger strike in Armagh prison. And that will be coming out later this year. And they're also on Ishog and Green Cross are bringing out, reissuing a brilliant LP, which was crucial to the campaigning, the H Block album from 1980. So they're bringing it out as a vinyl LP. Young people won't have a clue what we're talking about.
No,
right?
No.
But that's going to be reissued, and of course the diary has been reissued in a new format with extra material, other columns. So yes, acquaint yourselves with what went on. It was incredible. Just looking back at how families came through it, how they survived, the sanity of the surviving hunger strikers. And you know what's interesting, many of them went on to become elected reps. You know, Raymond McCartney in Derry, Pat Sheehan here in West Belfast, people like Lawrence McKeown, Dr. Lawrence McKeown went on to be, playwrights and authors. And then others like Carol Nichullin went on to become Minister of Arts here. You know, she did time, but after the restoration of political status. So it is an extraordinary, incredible story of prison struggle, which travels around the world. I mean, that, you look at, films made about Bobby Sands, documentaries made about the hunger strike, 66 Days, Steve McQueen's film Hunger, the songs that have been influenced by those men and by those women is extraordinary. It's a period of which we can feel immense pride and are completely in awe of them.
Well, I think that's a very suitable place to stop. Danny, we're in awe of you as well, and your story is incredible. And I want to wish you all the best in the future. We stand on the shoulders of giants, Danny, and I want to thank you for giving us your time today to share your reflections, your recollections, your memories, and thank you. Keep inspiring us.
And let me thank the people of Fermanagh and South Tyrone who initiated this fantastic transformation in our